You know, I was thinking this week about how that we respond to fear. Fear is not anything new. It's we look all the way back to the 3rd chapter of Genesis, and he was hiding himself in the garden, and God came along and asked him, called for him, and and he said, why were you hiding? And he said, what? I was afraid. I was afraid. So fear, well, just think a minute. What exactly is fear? Fear is a response, actually, I guess you would say, an involuntary response to a threat, either an actual or perceived threat to our well-being. It's either, it could be something present, something potential that requires some kind of response. And so it's sometimes when certain things happen, we feel that, not in the pit of our stomach, we feel a response to fear. And so as we think about how that things cause fear in our life, realize that the things that the media presents to us cause us to have fear for things that what is that saying that the news media has? If it bleeds, it leads. They want to instill fear in people because it sells, well, don't sell papers anymore, but it gets clicks today. Instead of selling newspaper, they're selling clicks, But that's the way that they make their money, is by causing fear. And when things happen, we worry about it. Fear and worry cause a tremendous amount of emotion. We waste a lot of emotional energy sometimes in reaction to those things. You see, the thing is, when fear happens, when fear takes place in our life, a lot of chemicals, adrenaline, all of these things run into our bloodstream. God created us that way for a reason. God created us so that we respond to fear by a lot of different ways. We call it the fight or flight response. And God created us so that when we have something happen, I'm walking through the woods and all of a sudden this big bear, that causes a reaction. It causes these hormones to be dumped into our bloodstream, run to our brain, and says, run. And when certain things happen, you know, those hormones come out, and the thing is, it calls for a response. And that's what I want us to look at for a few minutes this morning, is about the response. You know, we're told that 90% of actual physical problems with our bodies are not caused from things that are physical, but rather they're associated with fear and anxiety. It's amazing how that God created us that way, but God never created us to have continuous those hormones continuously being released. He created. You know, you think about you're lying in bed, sound asleep, 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. What's your response? It's never a good thing, right? It's bound to be something wrong. And so, what do? We respond with, you know, those hormones, that adrenaline suddenly releases, and we become nervous, we become fearful. We automatically react to it. The emotion of fear in itself is not wrong. The emotion of fear is our protection. God created it to protect us, to give us the ability to make certain response. Fear is that warning light that we're to look out because there's danger there. But it's how we respond to fear that can be a sin. Jesus affirmed that he loves us, and he said that his love for us is based on God's love, or in other words, our worth in God's eyes. And he gave some, we talked about last week in Matthew chapter 6, that Jesus gave some really good advice for us when he said, stop worrying. Don't worry about things. Don't worry about where you're going to get your food, or where you're going to get clothes to wear, or all of these things. But we respond to fear in different ways. When something takes place in our life that triggers fear, we respond often with a fight response. God gave us courage. He instills the courage for us to face threats and eliminate it. And sometimes when fear comes, that's what we're expected to do. Stand against it. Stand against whatever it is that the enemy is bringing to us. But sometimes we expend way too much energy trying to fight against things that we shouldn't. You remember several years ago, there were 5 missionaries to the Oka Indians. They decided when they were going into the area where these people were that they would not respond if they were attacked. And so these 5 missionaries were killed because they didn't respond. But the thing is, that lack of response affected those tribal Indians to the extent that later, a few years later, when some more missionaries came, they got saved. Because they said, what kind of people would stand and let us just kill them rather than fight back? And so that was their response. Later, there were a lot of people who responded to the call to missions based on what happened in that situation. So sometimes that, we call it the fight or flight. And sometimes we're expected to fight. God expects us to stand up against things that are wrong. Other times, he says, no, we're not to fight. Of course, the second thing is that flight response. Sometimes we're expected to flee when we're threatened. God sometimes puts us in situations for our own growth where running away is the right thing to do. Now think about it. Joseph and Mary had just had a child, and the life of that child was threatened by Herod. And God appeared to Joseph and told him to do what? Flee to Israel. In that situation, God's direction, God's plan, God's instruction to them was to flee. Don't stand and fight it, or don't have any of these other responses. He says, you need to go. Why? God could have taken care of the situation without them running away. God could have done like he did in our Sunday school lesson this morning, the 185,000 Assyrians. But God's plan was go to Egypt, run away. And this is not the only place in Scriptures where we see God instructing someone to flee. I think of Jesus. When he knew what was coming to him. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asked his disciples to come with him and pray. He knew what was coming. That fear, I guess. Jesus was human, just as we are. Even though he was God, he was still human. And he prayed to the Father, let this cup pass from me. I don't want to do this. But he said, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And so Jesus stayed the course. Even when he was fearful, he stayed the course. So the thing is, when God tells us to do something, we need to listen. We need to understand. We need to have that relationship with God. That when something comes into our lives, we have the response. We are listening to what God says. And I think this next thing is what God does not want us to do. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we flee, but sometimes we freeze. You know, you've heard of those times when something, that bear again. You're walking through the woods and that bear growls, and you're thinking, I want my feet to move real fast. But they don't listen. That's right. Often when people face conflict, when they face those fears, they freeze up. That is probably the wrong response in most cases. But there are times when God says to us, wait. We need to wait, not run, not fight, but wait for God's direction. It's never a good thing for us to get ahead of God. It's never a good thing for us to make our decision to go ahead and do something or not do something on our own. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Freezing up is an involuntary response to fear. But waiting on the Lord is something that we do voluntarily, and it's a known reaction. God often, I think, directs us to do that, directs us to wait. Let Him give us the direction. Fear paralyzes. We see the followers of Jesus at sometimes responding out of fear and letting those responses, letting the human side take over sometimes. In Acts chapter 4, verse 29, the Lord gives us instruction, and the disciples were asking. The disciples were recognizing that there was need for them to stand firm when they were faced with imprisonment. They were faced here Jesus had been executed, and they were his followers, and they were following after him. And so what was their response? It says, Lord, behold their threatenings, and grant unto thy servants that with all boldness that they may speak thy word. The disciples were saying, even in the face of the death, execution of Jesus, even in the face of Paul's ranting and raving and arresting people and carrying them to prison, Lord, help us to be bold. Help us to stand for what's right. And so, in other words, they were saying, Lord, help us not to freeze up. But we want to stand tall. We want to be like Jesus. The fourth response, and I'm afraid this may be the one that we too often go to, is to fret. That response is never healthy. And we talked about it last week, what Jesus said about worry. When things come into our life that require a response, we shouldn't worry and fret. It's probably the unhealthiest response of all the five we're talking about here, because that's the response that keeps us in that perpetual state of fear, that perpetual state of having those hormones continually being released. That's what causes health problems. And so many of the health problems today we see that come from those things. Because there's no, when we're fretting and worrying, that causes the adrenaline to continually be pumped into our bodies with no place for it to go. And so it stays there. Paul told the Philippians to stop worrying, stop fretting. Jesus told the disciples, stop worrying. Don't worry about things that you can't do anything about. So much of what we worry about never happens. So, how do we manage it? How do we prevent our mind from repeating those anxious thoughts that keep us in a perpetual state of impending doom and the threat of things in our life? Well, it's never healthy. But the greatest response, the best response, the response that is called for in Scripture is not to fret, but to have faith. Faith simply means trusting in the Lord. Trusting and being obedient to God's commands. When our mind is filled with fear, we must affirm that we know that God is present. And if He is present, then we have His help in every situation that we face. David counseled his son Solomon in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 20. Be strong and of good courage, and do it. Fear not, nor be dismayed. For the Lord God, even my God, will be with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee, until thou hast finished all the work. David told Solomon, instead of freezing up, instead of fighting, instead of all of these things, and instead of fretting about it, he said, trust the Lord. Be strong. Be of good courage. Don't fear, but do what God has commanded. God designed us with these physiological reactions to threatening situations. Fear readies us for action against a threat. And healthy fear keeps us from doing things that are silly. Doing things, if I'm walking up to the edge of a building, it's fear that keeps me a few inches back from the edge instead of getting too close, Fear in itself is of God. Fear in itself is a response that God built into our bodies to protect us. But He tells us in His Word how we must deal with it. Jesus encountered all kinds of situations. He faced rejection, torment, even physical torture, and an excruciating death. He was fully human, 100% man, even though He was God in the flesh. But God never